Hi everyone, I wanted to talk about this week's theme, form and value, and I'm going to have this video up on Canvas. I'm also going to try to record future class themes on Canvas just in case anyone misses any content or if they're out of town or sick, because right now Washington State has one of the highest risks for flu, so this way everyone's taken care of. So our theme for this week, form and value. Form refers to the illusion of three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional surface, and value refers to the lightness or darkness of something. So in this class, you're going to hear me talk a lot about the value scale. This is what I'm talking about right here, the value scale. It is the lightness or darkness of something. 10 is your super dark and 1 is your super light. It is not super intuitive for most people when they start to draw to really utilize the fullness of the scale. Actually, most people tend to really shy away from the values between 8 and 10. So you will hear me say the word value and talk about the value scale for the rest of the quarter because it's usually where people tend to fall shy. So as far as the value scale goes, this is kind of an example of value scales in every medium, and actually I have done this in my own, in my own sketchbook. And this is actually something that I want all of you to do as well in your sketchbook. I was going to have everyone do it in class, but if you're not in class, then please, in addition to your sketchbook homework, do a value scale page with every medium that you can get your hands on. I included charcoal on here, but if you are my Lake Washington class, you are not using charcoal, you're just using graphite. And if you are my Edmonds class, then you're using all of these things. So notice that I labeled, there we go, what each band is. And I'm left-handed, so I started at the darkest and then went to the lightest. You might want to start with the lightest and get to the darkest. I didn't just do this with pencil pressure. I also used my two erasers, my kneaded eraser and my white eraser, my Staedtler eraser, to lighten the areas that needed to be lightened so that it kind of seemed more like a complete gradient. You can also, if you're using pen, like I did at the very, very top, you can use a variety of mark making, like in this diagram right here, to get your full lights and darks that way. It's kind of fun to experiment. If you like drawing with pen and ink, then that is a great way to go. I highly recommend it. Just experiment with mark making to get all of your lights and your darks. So value tends to be the thing that really pushes that illusion of three-dimensionality on a page. You can kind of see here, they have their darkest darks, whereas over here, if you look at the comparison of the two spheres, the one that tends to have a little bit more contrast or a little bit more difference between the lights and the darks, that tends to be the thing that pops the most. Our eyes naturally want to go to where there's the most contrast. When you're looking at a work of art, your eye will naturally move to the areas that have the lightest lights and the darkest darks. So just keep that in mind while you are creating any of your artwork. You need to push your lights and your darks pretty far for it to look really convincing. So I did mention form, and we were working with contours last week. We started with contours because that's the best place to start with drawing. Generally, you will draw your contour and then you will add shadows in there. So shapes obviously are completely two-dimensional and they look two-dimensional. Forms instead have the illusion of that three-dimensionality. So it's basically a square versus a cube, or a pyramid versus a triangle, or a triangle versus a cone. And you get this illusion through shading. And if you're something like a pyramid or a cube, you also get it through the successful drawing of your contours. There are a lot of rules that apply to shadows. Generally, when people first start drawing they will, I don't know if I can do this backwards. Okay, so when they first start drawing, they want to put their highlights right on the edge, and then they'll start shading the whole rest of their sphere. So they'll have their whole highlight. I don't know if this is actually working. It is. There we go. So they'll have their whole highlight right on the edge like this. But in reality, it's more like this. It tends to, and I'll draw another sphere. Not a perfect sphere, but that's all right. If my light source is coming from this direction, your highlight will actually end up kind of in the top middle. And then your shadows will kind of break apart from there. Another thing people have a tendency to do is they want to shade straight lines like that. But, and this is why I had you guys doing those cross contours, if you shade along those cross contours, it will actually create something that looks a lot more spherical and a lot more convincing. And never be afraid, especially if you're using graphite, never be afraid to go too dark, because you can always go in and erase things. As a matter of fact, things tend to look better when there is a little bit of erasure marks. Yep. So you can kind of go in and I'm working from home, so I don't have a graphite stick with me, but they're great. And this would have made this way more fun. So basically you have your highlight right in the middle there. You'll have a little bit of a halftone, which is usually kind of the true color of whatever you're drawing. And then you'll have a kind of slightly darker shadow that's in between your halftone and what's known as your shadow core, which is going to be your darkest shadow. A lot of people have a tendency to drag this all the way down to the edge of their form, but there's almost always a reflected shadow in there. Light reflects off of the surface that your object is sitting on, and so to compensate for that, you need to add that reflected shadow in, even if you don't necessarily see it on your object. It is there, and creating that little reflected shadow tends to make your object look a lot more realistic. So then there's also the cast shadow, which people also have a tendency to forget about. People tend to render their objects a lot more beautifully than I did, but I am drawing this upside down, so you'll have to give me a break. But you can always clean up your edges with an eraser. Hooray! So I'm going to put my object on a surface, and since the light is coming from here, my cast shadow will be about there. Cast shadows are how you make your object look like it's sitting on something and not just floating in space ambiguously. There's frequently a core shadow. Oh man, that broke. That's a bummer. Huh. That's kind of funny. There's frequently a core shadow within your cast shadow, usually a smaller version of whatever your form is. So you can see how, I mean, I don't think I did this convincingly. Well, it's not bad. It's not great, but it's not bad. It makes the object look like it's actually sitting on something rather than just, you know, a random kind of sphere. So when you're drawing your cast shadow, there are a few rules to doing this. So, boy, I am just making a mess over here. So basically, you will have your light source, like in this image. And I'm going to just draw a little bounding box. And I'm going to draw a little light source. Yay, look at the sun. That's going this way. And I'm not going to... I'm going to draw a very quick cube and a horizon line. So I have drawn a super fast cube. There we go. With my light source. So there are actually some tricks to finding your cast shadow. And the big way is first, like in this little diagram here, you will draw a straight line down from your light source to your horizon line, which is what this is. And that can be the edge of your table, whatever, it doesn't really matter. So you'll draw a straight line down from your horizon line, and then you'll draw a line from the light source to whatever the top of your object is. In this case, it's that tree. If you, I'm going to do this in color. If you have something like a cube, you'll actually draw it to the top closest. Is this working? There we go. You'll draw it to your top closest corners. Obviously, you wouldn't do that back corner because you don't see the shadow that that thing is casting because it's facing away from you. So I did the 3 corners. Oh, there we go, right there. And I drew a line from those, from the light source to those. I think I have a purple pen that I'm going to use for this. So then you need that straight line that you drew down from the light source to your horizon line, and you're going to connect that with the bottom 3 corners and draw a line straight through those. And then in there, right? Is that right? And that will tell you where your cast shadow is. So I drew from this mark, I connected the top, I drew a line basically from that point through the corners of the cube, and then filled in my cast shadow there. If I continue drawing my line, if you want to use a ruler, that will make your life significantly easier. It would tell you where the cast shadow tends to end. If you just kind of keep waiting until the bottom line over here converges with the top line over here, that will tell you where the edge of your cast shadow will be. And I'm going to put some extra videos online in the module to show you other tricks with other weird shapes on there. So you can kind of see how they've done that here. It is very geometry based. So if you're good at geometry, you will be good at drawing cast shadows and perspective. If you're not good at geometry, you can still be good at it. I'm not great at it, but a lot of it is looking and then drawing straight lines with a ruler. So you can kind of see some examples here. You can also see kind of how they've done their shading around each of the edges. You'll notice that some of the planes, especially for the cube, those are different from each other as far as lightness and darkness goes. Same with the cylinder. Also notice how they've drawn through the object to make sure that they're ellipses, their bottom and their top match. So there's just some little tricks there. And then last but not least, for cast shadows, if you want your object to float, or if an object is hanging down and not connecting with the ground, it still casts a shadow. You just need to put some space in between the cast shadow and the object to convincingly make it look like it's floating. The further away the object gets from the ground, the smaller the cast shadow will be. So one of the big things that we're going to do in this class is drawing a still life, which is basically just drawing objects. And you can do this at home really easily. You can do it with a coffee cup, which is basically a cylinder with a handle on it. You can use a ball. You can use an Amazon box. Like, there are a million things for simple shapes. You can even draw your eraser. Your eraser is a really simple little box. And just put a highlight on it, maybe your phone flashlight or something. Having a nice definite light will give you good cast shadows. So one of the things we're doing in this class is drawing a lot of still lives. It's basically just drawing objects that don't move. So if you want to draw your puppy or your cat or your brother, those are not still lives because those are objects that all really like to move. My puppy right now likes to just sleep, but in about an hour, she will never stop moving for probably another 5 hours. So living things are not still lives. So as far as composing your still life, the first choice is to choose what format you want to do your still life in. So if you wanted to draw your still life on a piece of paper that's like this is a landscape format versus like this, which is a portrait format. And I know it seems really obvious, but a lot of people don't intentionally choose their format, and then they run out of room, or their composition doesn't look the way that they want them to look, and then they get really frustrated. So definitely think about how you want to compose your piece on the page, and which way do you want your page to be sitting. Definitely intentional choice. That's kind of what makes the difference between a good artist and a beginning artist, is that the good artist knows to intentionally choose which direction they want their paper to be sitting. There's also something called thumbnail sketches, which I mentioned in the first class. Thumbnail sketches are super tiny, quick planning sketches. They help you plan out how you want all of your objects to sit on the page. They help you plan out how much space you want around your objects. Do you want to zoom in and draw specific details, like in this one? Do you want to be drawing them from above? Do you want to be drawing them so that they're directly in front of you? Thumbnail sketches will help you figure all of this out before you spend an hour or more on your still life drawing. This is always a really good way to start this, and it shouldn't take long. It should only take maybe 3 to 5 minutes or less. I often will, in my sketchbook, I will draw, I'm going to do this. I'll draw maybe 6 of what I call bounding boxes, which are these little boxes here. And I'll do them in different format because then it makes me intentionally try out some different techniques. And then also it makes me want to fill all of these in. So usually if I'm drawing thumbnails, I'll draw all my bounding boxes first, and then I want to fill them all in. So then it makes me try things differently. And so right now I have a coffee cup hanging out over there. And so I'm going to draw that really quick with thumbnails. And so first I'm going to draw my desk. And I'll include value in my thumbnail as well. So it's not just about how I place the objects, it's also about how dark and light I want everything to be. So because my coffee cup is really light, I might want a really, really dark background. And it is sitting on this kind of cool piece of paper. So that'll kind of create some extra contrast. So yeah, this would be my first thumbnail. Super quick, super easy, not fully rendered. You don't want your thumbnails to look like finished sketches. Obviously in this diagram, they look really perfect. They probably spent closer to like 5 minutes on each one, which is a great exercise because it helps you look at things. But then if I decided, okay, I thought that that was too big, so now I'm going to draw it a little bit smaller, and I'm going to draw it on a landscape format. And while I made the whole background dark last time, maybe I'll just make one side of my drawing really dark. And I'll add the shadow this time. So yeah, I like that better than the first one. So I might be leaning towards that, but I can kind of keep practicing, keep pushing things around, maybe include some different things. And I would fill my whole page with thumbnail sketches. So that's kind of one of the things that I really want you guys to do and get in the habit of doing, is just thumbnail sketches forever, because they really help you plan out your artwork. And even with exercises, they help you really look at your object versus just kind of jumping into it and then making the mistakes in your first one. So another thing, like I mentioned before, where I was putting in darks and lights in my background, definitely consider how you want your background to look. You don't have to draw every single thing behind your still life. But sometimes, like in the one on the left, it looks really nice to have maybe a drop cloth or something, or some people will put, you know, bookshelves or wood grain or something else behind the object to kind of make it look a little bit more interesting. But you can also just leave a lot of negative space or empty space behind your objects to really highlight them. Like in this middle one, they don't even have a horizon line that it's sitting on, so you can't even tell really what it's on. They do still have their nice simple cast shadows, and there's a lot of texture, but it is empty. Same with over here, they went a little bit smaller than the page, but they decided to create a gradient, so it's sort of ambiguous empty space rather than just dark and light. So you have a lot of options, but you need to pick them intentionally. One thing that I do want to mention is that there's a bunch of different ways to add texture. And, you know, you might want to fully render your edges to make things look a lot more three-dimensional, but you can also, if you really love line, really practice with line quality, because outlines look really, really gorgeous frequently, even on fully rendered objects. So there are a number of ways that you can draw your still lifes, and all of them look great. But one thing to remember is, even if you are drawing white objects, they still will have, especially if it's all white objects, you will still need to include the full value scale in your still life. Always, always, always. This looks so much more dynamic than if I had, you know, stopped it early at maybe like a 7 in the value scale instead of going straight to a 10. It tends to create a lot more drama, and it tends to make things look a lot more three-dimensional. So as far as artists go, I wanted to highlight a couple of artists, actually I think 3 artists. One is Karen Broker. She does floral still lives that are massive. You can see here the scale of her floral still lives are pretty impressive. And they are very beautifully rendered. One of the reasons I really wanted to highlight her is because she uses these gorgeous bouquets in the center, but her backgrounds are still fully engaging. Her negative space still has a ton of stuff going on, a lot of texture, and this kind of really cool, almost writing looking chatter in the background. She also utilizes a lot of really cool collage work in her pieces. They're large scale charcoal drawings, and in this one is a pastel, and they're just really gorgeous. Alice Neal works mostly with line. Even in her large oil paintings, she tends to work with really gorgeous line. If you like pen and ink, you probably want to look a little bit more at Alice Neal because she has a very expressive use of line in her artworks. And she also has a tendency to use a lot of empty space, just like Karen Broker. But she tends to focus all of her contrast on a single focal point or a single point where your eye wants to go on her drawings and in her paintings as well. And she also uses really, really, really gorgeous, expressive hatching and cross hatching and squiggles. In this, I think she used some marker or some brush work for the ink. And it tends to make things look a little bit looser and a little bit more artistic rather than a fully rendered photographic drawing. And then last but not least is Jim Dine. He has done one of my all-time favorite series, which is his Tool series. They're almost abstract while also being really, really realistic, mostly because of how he arranges the tools on the page. They are front and center. They are the only thing that you really need to look at, but the way he draws the space around it is really, really gorgeous. He tends to put all of his contrast right around the objects, and then it kind of tapers off as it moves away from it. So your eye automatically wants to go right into this awl or right into these shears. And it's very, very successful. And sometimes he decides not even to finish all of the objects. Sometimes he wants to just focus on a single part, but his compositions are just really glorious and very intentional. He thinks very long and hard about how he wants to arrange things. So that is about it. I'm going to show you guys a quick demo with graphite. So I am using, if you guys have your graphite stick, use that. I have one of these all graphite pencils. Which they work fine. They aren't the best. They tend to break, which happened to me as I was drawing. It literally broke in half, which is fine because it's all graphite, so it's all useful. But I'm doing what's called a ground value. And you can do this with charcoal too. It's actually a little bit easier with charcoal, but I wanted to show people how to do it with graphite because that is mostly what we tend to work with and mostly what people are comfortable with. So I decided I didn't want to fill my entire sketchbook page with something, so I drew a bounding box or frame around where I want to draw. And I put kind of a medium value tone all over my paper. So I'm going to keep drawing my coffee cup because it's over in the corner and I like it. I'm not going to do a super realistic version of it. Let's see. I really liked it on the right. So when I have this value, this medium value, you can either go in with a pencil and start drawing in it, or you can also draw with your eraser, and I'm going to show what both of those look like. So I have the lid of my coffee cup, which is black, so I'm going to do that with my pencil. And then I'm going to go in with the bottom part, which is white, and I'm going to do that with my eraser. So I started with the lid just because I already had the pencil in my hand. You can start either way, and I'll be working back and forth anyway. So I started drawing with the lid. And now I'm going in with my Staedtler eraser. And I'm actually erasing out where the light parts are. The darker you go with your ground, the more dramatic this is going to look. So I started to erase out where the coffee cup is. If you go really, really dark, it will be really dramatic, but it will also be harder to erase with graphite. I recommend using your graphite stick for this. I would not recommend using your H pencils just because they're so hard, but I also wouldn't go above a 2B with doing the ground with graphite. So just keep that in mind. Yeah, now I'm just going to go in and start adding in some value around the coffee cup. And also correcting, because obviously I didn't get it right the first time. A lot of drawing is just self-correcting as you go until the drawing is done. You know, you're not going to get it perfect the first time. So do not be afraid of your eraser. Fall in love with your eraser. It does beautiful things. And also with forms like coffee cups, keep in mind that they are symmetrical. If you draw a line straight down the middle of them, they are going to be the same shape reversed on either side. So when I started drawing it, I noticed that I had the edges look a little bit wonky on either side, so I had to correct for that. And you can even draw a light line straight down the middle. And if you want to like measure either side of it as you go up, if you're not really sure, that's fine. And then you can always erase your line as you go. I don't have a super strong light source on this, and so I'm having a slightly hard time figuring out where my shadows would be. The stronger your light source is, the easier it'll be to figure out where your shadows are. So if you want to put your object near a lamp or put a flashlight on it or something like that, it will give you a lot more contrast. It will make your drawing a lot more interesting, and it'll be a lot easier to draw. So I'm adding some shading in. I tend to not blend much, even with graphite, just because I feel like it looks really messy. But if you want, you can actually blend your graphite with the edge of your eraser. That's what I just did. I just went in, I had all of the directional marks, and I actually just lightly, barely putting any pressure on it, I went in and I'm actually holding this almost parallel to the page, but it will kind of smudge out all of those graphite marks if you don't like them. I really like them, and also people who overblend tend to make things look dirty pretty quickly, but that is an option if you so choose. So the thing that I'm missing right now, of course, is the cast shadow. My light is coming from a whole bunch of directions in this room, but based on my shadow that I kind of created, I'm going to put my light source where the circle is outside. And so based on that, and this is where it's kind of nice to draw through things, because it'll tell me where my cast shadow is. So I drew my lines from the light source, and I drew it on a couple of edges, on the back edge and the front edge of my coffee cup, and that'll tell me that my cast shadow, my imaginary cast shadow, is right there. So those are some techniques for drawing. You might notice I was working back and forth between eraser and the graphite. I was working mostly with my graphite stick, which this is basically a 6B. If you want to start really light, I would start with your H's. So this is where I would start with the value scale, because you'll notice that you have, your darkest dark with the H is actually pretty light compared to, your 6B or even your 8B, which is super, super, super dark. You'll also notice that the black for the charcoal is completely different from the black for the graphite. So mixing the two, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If you want to experiment, I always encourage it, but just know that sometimes it does tend to look weird, especially since graphite is pretty shiny and charcoal is pretty matte. I tend to not mix the two. But yeah, I would just experiment in your sketchbook. Your sketchbooks are going to be due next week. I know that we didn't have class this week, but I want you guys to still be drawing, and I just showed you guys some techniques in my sketchbook. If you don't have your sketchbook with you for whatever reason, just draw even on computer paper, napkins, any kind of paper you can get a hold of, newspaper, if you want to even draw on top of something that already has something on it. Sometimes that makes a really interesting looking drawing. And then you can either tape or glue that into your actual sketchbook later. I do that all the time. My sketchbook it's usually 3 times thicker by the time I finish a sketchbook than it originally was, because I'm constantly pasting and collaging things in. So you definitely need 10 sketches, 2 of which are master copies, by next week, and I will be grading them and getting feedback, so keep that in mind. And then next week we're going to be working on, instead of working on your first project, I think instead we're going to focus on composition, and I'm going to be giving you all some exercises for composition and figuring out how to arrange things on the page. If you have any questions, feel free to email me through Canvas or through my school email. Obviously, Canvas is always the fastest because it tends to go straight to my phone. But yeah, if you have any questions or concerns or need any feedback, feel free to reach out to me, and happy drawing.